Welcome to the female reproductive system. The primary role of the system is to produce eggs, and the eggs are also known as ova, ovum for one, ova for many. It also produces some sex hormones, and it has structures that will help to support and protect a growing embryo. The major structures include the ovary. Now, there are two of these structures, so we usually say ovaries. We also have the uterine tube. Again, there are two of these structures, so we usually call them the uterine tubes, or you can say the fallopian tubes. Then we have the uterus, the vagina, and the external genitalia. One more structure that isn't here is the mammary gland. Okay, it is part of the female reproductive system. We also have the accessory glands. They are homologous, they're similar to the accessory glands that we saw in the male reproductive system. Before I go further, I would like to introduce you to a mesentery found within the female reproductive system. It is called the broad ligament. This is an extensive mesentery that encloses the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, and the uterus. It creates two regions known as pouches, and these regions are basically spaces, right? The first one is called the rectouterine pouch. It is found between the sigmoid colon and the posterior wall of the uterus. The second one is called the vesicouterine pouch. It is found between the anterior wall of the uterus and the posterior wall of the bladder. Now, let's talk about the structures that will stabilize the position of the ovaries. The first one will be the ovarian ligament, which attaches, or you can say anchor, the ovary to the lateral surface of the uterus. The other one is a suspensory ligament. It anchors the ovary to the pelvic wall. And associated with it is the ovarian artery and the ovarian vein. Now, the ovaries have two layers. The outermost layer is made of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, and this outer layer is called the germinal epithelium. The innermost layer is more of a fibrous, connective tissue, and it is called the tunica albuginea. This is the inner one. Okay. Now, the ovaries do have a cortical region and a medullary region. So this is the cortex, and this is the medulla. Within the cortex are ovarian follicles of different stages, and these ovarian follicles contain oocytes, which are immature eggs. So here is another histological slide of the ovaries. You can see the germinal right here, epithelium. Okay, it's more of the outer one. And then you can also see the tunica albuginea, the fibrous, dense connective, tissue. And then here we have the cortex. This is the cortex here. You can see all of these ovarian follicles here at their different stages. And then at the center, of course, we have the medullary region that usually has the blood vessels. Now we're going to talk about the fallopian tubes, also known as the uterine tube, but I like to call it the fallopian tube. The fallopian tubes are going to help to transport the eggs, the ova or ovum, from the ovaries towards the uterus. Now, the fallopian tubes, they have a region known as the infundibulum. It's a funnel-shaped region. And this region also contains some finger-like projections called the fimbriae. The fimbriae contains cilia, so it will help to move any ovum that is received into the fallopian tube. So think of it this way. The fimbriae are finger-like projections that basically sweep up the egg during ovulation. Okay? Now, there's a region known as the ampulla. And this ampulla region is actually the normal site of egg fertilization. I hope you remember that, okay? The ampulla is the normal site of egg fertilization within the fallopian tubes. So here is a histological slide just showing you the internal structures of the fallopian tubes. So here we have the lumen, and then we have these columnar epithelial tissues here, and of course we have some smooth muscle structures. Oh, this is very important. Okay, next let's talk about the uterus. The uterus has three major regions. Now the uterus will be the site of implantation. So once an egg has been fertilized, the uterus will receive it and basically support the implantation of the egg and also support the growth of an embryo. The three regions of the uterus are the fundus, this is the upper round region, and then we have the body. Next, we have the neck of the uterus. It's called the cervix. The cervix has two openings to it. First, we have the cervical canal, which is this part right here. All right, and then we have the internal os. This is the internal opening, and then we have the external os, which is the external opening. So here are the layers of the uterine wall. The innermost one is the endometrium, and then the middle one is the myometrium. It is a muscular wall made of smooth muscle, okay, very thick. In the outermost region, right here, we have the perimetrium. Okay, I want you to notice the uterine artery and vein associated with the uterus. They supply it with blood. Now, remember what I said about the neck of the uterus, which is the cervix? Well, here are those structures again. We have the cervical canal, right? This pathway right here. And then we have the internal os, the internal opening, and the external os, the external opening. Let's focus on the endometrial layer. Why is it important? Well, ladies, every month you usually undergo your period. There is one layer of the uterine wall that is shed every month, and that layer is the endometrial layer. It is the one closest to the uterine cavity. Now, this layer has two zones to it, two important zones. The first one is the functional zone. The functional zone contains a lot of uterine gland. Okay, also these glands are very mucus. They produce a mucus-rich fluid. All right. Now, the functional zone contains the spiral artery. It's supplied by the spiral artery. So you can just split this down into two halves right here, and you'll have the functional zone above, and then the second zone is known as the basilar zone. It is supplied by the straight artery. Now, why is the functional zone important? This is the zone that experiences a lot of thickening during our menstrual cycle, and it is the zone that is shed off every month for females. Okay? Now, once the functional zone is shed off, the basilar zone, under the influence of estrogen, the basilar zone will form a new layer of the functional zone. Please remember that. Okay, so every month during the menstrual cycle, the functional zone, it usually thickens in size and eventually is shed off. Okay, it is sloughed off. And the basilar zone, under the influence of estrogen, it will grow back the functional zone. Now the vagina. It is an elastic muscular tube. It extends from the cervix and opens into the vestibular region of the external genitalia. It usually receives the penis and semen during sexual intercourse. It also serves as the birth canal during childbirth. Now the vaginal walls, the vaginal canal, when you look at it, it does have a lot of rugae. Now, for someone that has never had sex before, you would expect to see a membranous structure called the hymen. It's usually a partial covering over the opening of the vaginal canal. However, activities such as, riding a horse or exercising gymnastics, basically any athletic activity can actually tear up this hymen before the first sexual, activity. Now, one thing I want you to know here is this. The vaginal canal, as it extends from the cervix all the way down to the vestibular region, it surrounds the cervix, creating basically two regions. And these regions are known as fornix. To me, they're a little invagination within the upper region of the vagina. So we have the anterior fornix and we also have the posterior fornix. So here is a histological slide of the vagina. Here is the vaginal canal, its lumen. This is the lumen. And then I want you to take a look at this. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue, not the keratinized version, okay? Just regular stratified squamous epithelial tissue, okay? And then we have the blood vessels, of course, but notice this, we have a ton of smooth muscle fibers in here. So yes, it is a muscular tube. Now, the external genitalia, also known as the vulva, consist of several structures. The first one is the mons pubis. This is the outermost structure. It's usually the upper round ridge region over the pelvic bone, and it's a hairy region of the external genitalia. Next, we have the labia majora. It does have a little one known as the minora, the labia minora. Now these are two skin folds. The outermost one is the labia majora, is the largest one, and it tends to have some hair-like structures there sometimes. Now the labia minora is the inner skin fold. Okay, it's usually hairless. Now all that covers a structure called the clitoris or the clitoris. The clitoris itself is actually a sensory organ for the female reproductive system. It is homologous to the penis, so it does have some erectile tissues. Okay? It is covered by a layer of skin, or you can say tissue, known as the prepuce. The prepuce. The prepuce is the hood of the clitoris. Now, just like in the male reproductive system, the female one has some accessory glands. And the one I want you to focus on is the vestibular gland. Yes, it is called the greater vestibular gland. It is homologous to the bulbourethral gland in males. Why? It produces a lot of mucus. It produces a lot of mucus-rich fluid that will help to lubricate the vestibular region. Right? Then we have the perineum region. The perineum region. The perineum region is just a soft tissue between the anus and the vaginal opening. Why is it important? This region is usually torn during childbirth. Sometimes it's naturally torn, other times the doctors have to tear it. Why? To allow the head of the baby to fit through and come out of the birth canal. So this process is what we call episiotomy. It is a very painful process and it takes some time for females to heal once they have had this process during childbirth. Finally, we have the mammary glands. They are responsible for milk production, involved in lactation. So, what are they? What are the structures found within the mammary gland? Okay, first we have a pectoral fat pad. So, we have a protective adipose tissue here that sits just right in front of the pectoralis major muscle. And then we have the secretory alveolar structures. Okay. And these secretory alveolar structures will then combine to create clusters called lobules. And each of those lobules are actually drained by a lactiferous duct. Right? The secretory alveoli, they are the ones responsible for secreting the milk. Okay? So when they secrete it through the lactiferous duct. And the lactiferous duct then forms the lactiferous sinus, which basically is just a dilated form of the lactiferous duct. And then eventually it pours out into the nipple. Okay, now surrounding the nipple is a pigmented skin region known as the areola. So let's talk about some hormonal control of, milk production in the mammary gland. So remember this hormone, prolactin. Prolactin is responsible for milk production. Without it, the mammary glands will not produce milk. Oxytocin is responsible for milk ejection. Okay? So make sure you remember that, all right? Prolactin for milk production, oxytocin for milk ejection. Okay? And another thing that oxytocin does is it actually promotes the uterine contraction. So the contraction of the smooth muscles of the uterine wall. And those contractions will usually what? Promote the childbirth, right? It will promote the movement of the that fetus out of the uterine canal. All right, so oxytocin has two functions, important for milk ejection and also important for uterine contractions during childbirth.